Oh yeah, come on. Come on now. There we are. There we are. Now YouTube is doing it. And Facebook, I'm sure you're probably doing it too. Are you doing the live thing? Are people able to see that I'm going live? Is that a thing, right? I sure hope so. Yes, it looks like we are live. It's about time, Facebook. So, sorry, it's a little late tonight, late this evening. That's all right, though, because it's still happening, right? I told you, if you're on Facebook, that I would be a little late tonight, but I'm a little later than I expected. Yes, it's nearly 11 o'clock. It's 10:49. Hello, Heather. Glad to see you. Glad you have joined us. Thank you for commenting. But yes, I was a little busier than I expected to be tonight, but now I am free and I'm here for story time. I'm here to read Holes. Yes, tonight we pick up Holes at part 9. Isn't it amazing? We're getting so far. Hello, Shay. I see you have joined us on Facebook. Glad to have you here as well. And thank you for sharing the story time post. Anyway, like I said, I did post on Facebook that I would be a little late tonight, so I apologize for that, but I'm glad that you're here, for those of you who are here, and I'm glad for those who are going to be here. Just a little later than the others, right? Ooh, it appears I am a little sweaty. Yes, it was some busy work earlier, but that's okay. It was fun, and I think it will be fruitful. At least I hope it will. Hello, Amber. Glad you have joined us on YouTube. And still waiting for more to join us on Facebook. I see Fleur has joined us. Hello, how are you, my friend, across the sea? Glad to see you. It's been a while, and I hope you're doing well. Anyway, just some quick announcements. Story time right now is staying at 10 o'clock, with the exception of a few times when I might have to go early or late, in which case I usually give notifications for that. But for now, it's still 10 o'clock. And if you have not already, join the Facebook group Storytime, exclamation point at the end, 2 words. And follow me on YouTube as well. B Picorni1. B as in boy, P as in price, O-K-O-R, N as in letter Y. The number 1. And that's it. It's, it's B Picorni1. So find me on there so you can like this video. Yes, if you're watching, hit this now. Just, yes, hit like, please. I'd appreciate it very much. Oh, if you haven't, hit subscribe. That way you will get notifications for when I go live with story time or other videos, as well as when I post other videos. So don't want to miss out on that. And, sorry, hang now. And when I go for future videos, when I do future videos as well, for online. Oh, is that a rip? There's a small hole in my shirt. Oh, well. It's a workout shirt anyway. But anyway, for when I go future videos on Twitch, you want to follow my gamer tag. That would be Brett Doesn't Game. All one word, no punctuation, apostrophes, or anything like that. Just one big word. And hello, Flo. I see you have commented as well. Thank you for being here. Good to see you. Choose between you and Oliver and Company. Oh, I'm sorry, Amber. It's such a difficult decision, isn't it? But here's the thing about there's a huge hole right there. This is an old workout shirt. Okay. Perhaps it will have to become a rag for the car. Anyway, remember, Amber, you can catch this rerun. You can watch these episodes anytime. So you can come back to it later if you like. Either way, glad you're here, all of you. And without further ado, let us get down to the nitty-gritty. Let us start reading Holes, back from where we left off at part 9. But, one thing before we do, I feel it is my duty to give you a word from our sponsors. I'd like to say a few words about them, and no, I'm not actually sponsored, but wouldn't it be cool if I were? For that reason, I'll pretend that I am. Our first sponsor is Big League Chew, the greatest bubblegum in all the world. If you like gum, you'll love Big League Chew. Our second sponsor is Bubble Yum, the greatest bubblegum in all the world. If you like bubblegum, you'll love Bubble Yum. Our third sponsor is Bazooka Joe, the greatest bubblegum. Really? No, you're not Bazooka Joe. You're not fine. The greatest bubblegum in all the world. If you love gum, you'll love Bazooka Joe. And that, everyone, concludes tonight's sponsors. Even though the third one's made of concrete. Anyway, shall we press on to the story? And hello, Mum, I see you've joined. Shall we press on to the story. Yes, I will stop numbing your skulls. Back to holes, part 9. Stanley bit into an onion. A place to pick up. It didn't burn his eyes or nose, and in fact, he no longer noticed a particularly strong taste. He remembered when he had first carried Zero up the hill how the air had smelled bitter. It was the smell of thousands of onions, growing and rotting and sprouting. Now he didn't smell a thing. "How many onions do you think we've eaten?" he asked. Zero shrugged. "I don't even know how long we've been here." "I'd say about a week," said Stanley. "And we probably each eat about 20 onions a day, so that's 200. Stanley smiled. "I bet we really stink." 2 nights later, Stanley lay awake, staring up at the star-filled sky. He was too happy to fall asleep. He knew he had no reason to be happy. He had heard or read somewhere that right before a person freezes to death, he suddenly feels nice and warm. He wondered if perhaps he was experiencing something like that. It occurred to him that he couldn't remember the last time he felt happiness. It wasn't just being sent to Camp Green Lake that had made his life miserable. Before that, he'd been unhappy at school, where he had no friends, and bullies like Derek Dunn picked on him. No one liked him, and the truth was, he didn't especially like himself. He liked himself now. He wondered if he was delirious. He looked over at Zero, sleeping near him. Zero's face was lit in the starlight, and there was a flower petal in front of his nose that moved back. It reminded Stanley of something out of a cartoon. Zero breathed in, and the petal was drawn up, almost touching his nose. Zero breathed out, and the petal moved toward his chin. It stayed on Zero's face for an amazingly long time before fluttering off to the side. Stanley considered placing it back in front of Zero's nose, but it wouldn't be the same. It seemed like Zero had lived at Camp Green Lake forever, but as Stanley thought about it now, he realized that Zero must have gotten there no more than a month or 2 before him. Zero was actually arrested a day later, but Stanley's trial kept getting delayed because of baseball. He remembered what Zero had said a few days before. If Zero had just kept those shoes, neither of them would be here right now. Stanley stared at the glittering night sky. He thought there was no place he would rather be. He was glad Zero put the shoes on the parked car. He was glad they fell from the overpass and hit him on the head. Darn hangnail. There we go. When the shoes first fell from the sky, he remembered thinking that destiny had struck him. Now he thought so again. It was more than a coincidence. It had to be destiny. Maybe they wouldn't have to return to Camp Green Lake, he thought. Maybe they could make it past the camp, then follow the dirt road back to civilization. They could fill the sack with onions and the 3 jars with water, and he had his canteen as well. They could refill their jars and canteen at the camp. Maybe sneak into the kitchen and get some food. He doubted any counselors were still on guard. Everybody had to think that they were dead. Buzzard food. It would mean living the rest of his life as a fugitive. The police would always be after him. At least he could call his parents and tell them he was alive. But he couldn't go visit them, in case the police were watching the apartment. Although if everyone thought he was dead, they wouldn't bother to watch the apartment. He would have to somehow get a new identity. Now I'm really thinking crazy, he thought. He wondered if a crazy person wonders if he's crazy. But even as he thought this, an even crazier idea kept popping into his head. He knew it was too crazy to even consider. Still, if he was going to be a fugitive for the rest of his life, it would help to have some money, perhaps a treasure chest full of money. You're crazy, he told. Besides, just because he found a lipstick container with KB on it, that didn't mean there was treasure buried there. It was crazy. It was all part of his crazy feelings of happiness. Or maybe it was destiny. He reached over and took Zero's arm. "Hey, Zero," he whispered. "Huh?" "Zero, wake up." "What?" Zero raised up his head. "What is it?" "You want to dig one more hole?" Stanley asked him. "We weren't always homeless." "A yellow room. How old were you when you—" Stanley started to ask, but couldn't find the right words. "Moved out." "I don't know. I must have been real little because I really don't remember too much. I don't remember moving out. I remember standing in a crib with my mother singing to me. She held my wrists and made my hands. She used to sing that song to me, the one you sang. It was different, though." Zero spoke slowly, as if searching for clues. "And then later, I know we lived on the street, but I don't know why we left the house. I'm pretty sure it was a house, not an apartment. I know my room was yellow. It was late afternoon. They were resting in the shade of the thumb. They had spent the morning picking onions and putting them in the sack. It didn't take long, but they had enough, so long enough, so they had to wait another day before heading down the mountain. They wanted to leave at the first hint of daylight, so that they'd have plenty of time to make it to Camp Green Lake before dark. Stanley waited to be sure he could find the right hole. Then they would hide by it until everyone went to sleep. They would dig for as long as it seemed safe, not a second longer, and then, treasure or no treasure, they'd head up the dirt road. If it was absolutely safe, they'd try to steal some food and water from the camp kitchen. "I'm good at sneaking in and out," he said. Remember, Stanley had warned, the door to the rec room squeaks. Now he lay on his back, trying to save his strength for the long days ahead. He wondered what happened to Zero's parents, but he didn't ask. Zero didn't like answering questions. It was better to just let him talk when he felt like it. Stanley thought about his own parents. In her last letter, his mom was worried that they might be evicted from the apartment because of the smell of burning sneakers. They could easily become homeless as well. Again, he wondered if they'd been told that he ran away from camp. Were they told that he was dead? An image appeared in his head of his parents, hugging each other and crying. Instead, he tried to recapture the feelings he'd had the night before, the inexplicable feeling of happiness, the sense of destiny. But those feelings didn't return. He just felt scared. The next morning, they headed down the mountain. They dunked their caps in the waterhole before putting them on their heads. Zero held the shovel, and Stanley carried the sack, which was crammed with onions and the 3 jars of water. They left the pieces of the broken jar on the mountain. "This is where I found the shovel," Stanley said, pointing out a patch of weeds. Zero turned and looked up toward the top of the mountain. "That's a long way." "You were light," Stanley said. "You'd already thrown up everything that was inside your sack." They shifted the sack from one shoulder to the other. It was heavy. He stepped on a loose rock, slipped, then fell hard. The next thing he knew, he was sliding down the steep side of the mountain. He dropped the sack, and onions spilled all around him. He slid into a patch of weeds and grabbed onto a thorny vine out of the earth, but slowed him enough so that he was able to stop himself. "You all right?" Zero asked from above. Stanley groaned as he pulled a thorn out of the palm of his hand. "Yeah," he said. He was all right. He was worried more about the jars of water. Zero climbed down after him, retrieving the sack along the way. Out of his pant leg. The jars hadn't broken. The onions had protected them like styrofoam. "Glad you didn't do that when you were carrying me," Zero said. They lost about a third of the onions, but recovered many of them as they continued down the mountain. When they reached the bottom, the sun was just rising above the lake. They walked directly toward it. Soon, they stood on the edge of a cliff, looking down on the dry lake bed. Stanley wasn't sure, but he thought he could see the remains of the Mary Lou off in the distance. "You thirsty?" Stanley asked. "No," said Zero. "How about you?" "No," Stanley lied. He didn't want to be the first one to take a drink. Although they didn't mention it, it had become a kind of challenge between him and Zero. They climbed down into the frying pan. It was a different spot from where they had climbed up. They eased themselves down from one ledge to another and let themselves slide in other places, being especially careful with the sack. Stanley could no longer see the Mary Lou, but headed in what he thought was the right direction. As the sun rose, so did the familiar haze of heat and dirt. "You thirsty?" Zero asked. "No," said Stanley. "Because you have 3 full jars of water," said Zero. "I thought maybe it was getting too heavy for you. If you drink some, it'll lighten your load." "I'm not thirsty," said Stanley, "but if you want a drink, I'll give you some." "I'm not thirsty," said Zero. "I was just worried about you." Stanley smiled. "I'm a camel," he said. They walked for what seemed like a very long time, and still never came across the Mary Lou. Stanley was pretty sure they were headed in the right direction. He remembered that when they left the boat, they were headed toward the setting sun. Now they were heading toward the rising sun. He knew the sun didn't rise and set exactly in the east and west, more southeast and southwest, but he wasn't sure how that made a difference. He felt his throat as if it was coated with sandpaper. "You sure you're not thirsty?" he asked. "Not me," said Zero. His voice was dry and raspy. When they did finally take a drink, they agreed to do it at the same time. Zero, who was now carrying the sack, set it down and took out 2 jars, giving one to Stanley. They decided to save the canteen for last, since it couldn't accidentally break. "You know I'm not thirsty," Stanley said as he unscrewed the lid. "I'm just drinking so you will." "I'm just drinking so you will," said Zero. They clinked the jars together, each watching the other, poured the water into their stubborn mouths. Zero was the first to spot the Mary Lou, maybe a quarter mile away and just a little off to the right. They headed for it. It wasn't even noon yet when they reached the boat. They sat against the shady side and rested. "I don't know what happened to my mother," Zero said. "She left and never came back." Stanley peeled an onion. "She couldn't always take me with her," Zero said. "Sometimes she had to do things by herself." Stanley had the feeling that Zero was explaining things to himself. "She'd tell me to wait in a certain place for her. When I was real little, I had to wait in small areas, like on a porch step or a doorway. Now don't leave here until I get back," she'd say. I liked it when she left. I had a stuffed animal, like a little giraffe, and I'd hug it the whole time she was gone. When I got bigger, I was allowed to stay in bigger areas, like stay on this block or don't leave the park. But even then, I still had Jaffe." Stanley guessed that Jaffe was the name of Zero's giraffe. "And then one day she didn't come back," Zero said. His voice sounded suddenly hollow. "I waited for her at Laney Park." "Laney Park," said Stanley. "I've been there." "You know the playscape?" asked Zero. "Yeah, I've played on it." "I waited there for more than a month," said Zero. "You know that tunnel that you crawl through between the slide and the swinging bridge? That's where I slept." They ate 4 onions apiece and drank about half a jar of water. Stanley stood up and looked around. Everything looked the same in all directions. "When I left, I was heading straight toward Big Thumb," he said. "I saw the boat off to the right, so that means we have to turn a little to the left." Zero was lost in thought. "What?" "Okay," he said. They headed out. It was Stanley's turn to carry the sack. "Some kids had a birthday party," Zero said. "I guess it was about 2 weeks after my mother left. There was a picnic table next to the playscape and balloons were tied to it. The kids looked to be the same age as me. One girl said hi to me and asked if I wanted to play. I wanted to, but I didn't. I knew I didn't belong at the party, even though it wasn't their playscape. There was this one mother who kept staring at me like I was some kind of monster. Then later a boy asked me if I wanted a piece of cake, but then that same mother told me, 'Go away,' and she told all the kids to stay away from me, so I never got the piece of cake. I ran away so fast I forgot Jaffe. Did you ever it?" For a moment Zero didn't answer. Then he said, "He wasn't real." Stanley thought again about his own parents. How awful it would be for them to never know if he was dead or alive. He realized that was how Zero must have felt, not knowing what happened to his own mother. He wondered why Zero never mentioned his father. "Hold on," Zero said, stopping abruptly. "We're going the wrong way." "No, this is right," said Stanley. "You were heading toward Big Thumb when you saw the boat off to your right," said Zero. "That means we should..." "You sure?" Zero drew a diagram in the dirt. Stanley still wasn't sure. "We need to go this way," Zero said, first drawing a line on the map and then head. It didn't feel right to him, but Zero seemed sure. Sometime in the middle of the afternoon, a cloud drifted across the sky and blocked out the sun. It was a welcome relief. Once again, Stanley felt that destiny was on his side. Zero stopped and held out his arm to stop Stanley too. "Listen," Zero whispered. Stanley didn't hear anything. They continued walking very carefully, and Stanley began to make out the faint sounds of Camp Green Lake. They were still too far off to see the camp, but he could hear a blend of indistinct voices. As they got closer, he occasionally could hear Mr. Sir's distinctive bark. They walked slowly and quietly, aware that sounds travel in both directions. They approached a cluster of holes. "Let's wait here until they go in," said Zero. Stanley nodded. He checked to make sure there was nothing living in it, then climbed down into a hole. Zero climbed into the one next to him. Despite having gone the wrong way for a while, it hadn't taken them nearly as long as Stanley had expected. Now they just had to wait. The sun cut through the cloud, and Stanley felt its rays beating down on him. But soon more clouds filled the sky, shading Stanley and his hole. He waited until he was certain the last of the campers had finished for the day. Then he waited a little bit longer. As quietly as possible, he and Zero climbed up out of their holes and crept toward camp. Stanley held the sack in front of him, cradled in his arms instead of over his shoulder to keep the jars from clanking against each other. A wave of terror rushed over him when he saw the compound, the tents, the rec room, the warden's cabin under the 2 oak trees. The fear made him dizzy. He took a breath, summoned his courage, and continued. "That's the one," he whispered, pointing out the hole where he had found the gold tube. It was still about 50 yards away, but Stanley was pretty sure it was the right hole. There was no need to risk going any closer. They climbed down into adjacent holes and waited for the camp to fall asleep. Stanley tried to sleep, not knowing when he'd get the chance again. He heard the showers and later the sounds of dinner. He heard the creaking of the rec room doors. His fingers drummed against the side of the hole. He heard his own heart beat. He took a drink from the canteen. He had given Zero the water jugs. They each had a good supply of onions. He wasn't sure how long he remained in the hole, maybe 5 hours. He was surprised when he heard Zero whispering for him to wake up. He didn't think he'd fallen asleep. If he had, he thought it must have just been for the last 5 minutes, although when he opened his eyes, he was surprised how dark it was. There was only one light on at camp, in the office. The sky was cloudy, so there was very little starlight. Stanley could see a sliver of a moon, which appeared and disappeared disappeared among the clouds. He carefully led Zero to the hole, which was hard to find in the darkness. He stumbled over a small pile of dirt. "I think this is it," he whispered. "You think?" Zero asked. "It's it," said Stanley, sounding more certain than he really was. He climbed down. Zero handed him the shovel. Stanley stuck the shovel into the dirt at the bottom of the hole and stepped on the back of the blade. He felt it sink beneath his weight. He scooped out some dirt and tossed it off to the side. Then he brought the shovel back down. Zero watched for a while. "I'm going to try to refill the water jars," he said. Stanley took a deep breath and exhaled. "Be careful," he said, then continued digging. It was so dark he couldn't even see the end of his shovel. For all he knew, he could be digging up gold and diamonds instead of dirt. He brought each shovelful close to his face to try to see if anything was there before dumping it out of the hole. As he made the hole deeper, it became harder to lift the dirt up and out. It was 5 feet deep before he even started. He decided to use his efforts to make it wider instead. This made more sense, he told himself. If Kate Barlow had buried a treasure chest, she probably wouldn't have been able to dig much deeper, so why should she? Of course, Kate Barlow probably had a whole gang of thieves helping her. "You want some breakfast?" Stanley jumped at the sound of Zero's voice. He hadn't heard him approach. Zero handed down a box of cereal. Stanley carefully poured some cereal into his mouth. He didn't want to put his dirty hands inside the box. He nearly gagged on the ultra-sweet taste. They were sugar-frosted flakes, and after eating nothing but onions for more than a week, he had trouble adjusting to the flavor. He washed them down with a swig of water. Zero took over the digging. Stanley sifted his fingers through the fresh piles of dirt in case he had missed anything. He wished he had a flashlight. A diamond no bigger than a pebble would be worth thousands of dollars. Yet there was no way he'd see it. They finished the water that Zero had gotten from the spigot by the showers. Stanley said he'd go fill the jars again, but Zero insisted that he do it instead. "No offense, but you make too much noise when you walk. You're too big." Stanley returned to the hole. As the hole grew wider, parts of the surface kept caving in. They were running out of room. To make it much wider, they would first have to move some of the surrounding dirt piles out of the way. He wondered how much time they had before the camp woke up. "Real quick, just want to see some hellos. See who else has commented. Hello, Miss Kuntz. Good to see you. Glad you're here. I love holes as well. It's such a great story. And let's see. That's the word of the night, huh? Lol, crazy. Crazy. Apparently crazy is the word of the night. Yes. All right. Enough questions and shout-outs and stuff. Back to it. Doo-doo. "How's it going?" Zero asked when he returned with the water. Stanley shrugged one shoulder. He brought the shovel down the side of the hole, shaving off a slice of the dirt wall. As he did so, he felt the shovel bounce off something hard. "What was that?" Zero asked. Stanley didn't know. He moved his shovel up and down the side of the hole. As the dirt chipped and flaked away, the hard object became more pronounced. It was sticking out of the side of the hole, about 1.5 feet from the bottom. He felt it with his hands. "What is it?" Zero asked. He could just feel the corner of it. Most of it was still buried. It had the cool, smooth texture of metal. "I think I might have found the treasure chest," he said. His voice was filled with more astonishment than with excitement. "Really?" asked Zero. "I think so," Stanley said. The hole was wide enough for him to shove the shovel lengthwise and dig sideways into the wall. He knew he had to dig very carefully. He didn't want the side of the hole to collapse, along with the huge pile of dirt directly above it. He scraped at the dirt wall until he exposed one entire side of the box. He ran his fingers over it. It felt to be about 8 inches tall and almost 2 feet wide. He had no way of knowing how far into the earth it extended. He tried pulling it out, but it wouldn't budge. He was afraid that the only way to get it was to start back up at the surface and dig down. They didn't have time for that. "I'm going to try to dig a hole underneath it," he said. "Then maybe I can pull it down and slip it out." "Go for it," said Zero. Stanley jammed the shovel into the bottom edge of his hole and carefully began to dig a tunnel underneath the metal object. He hoped it didn't cave in. Occasionally he'd stop, stoop down, and try to feel the far end of the box. but even when the tunnel was as long as his arm, he still couldn't feel the other side. Once again, he tried pulling it out, but it was very firmly in the ground. If he pulled too hard, he feared he'd cause a cave-in. He knew that when he was ready to pull it out, he would have to do it quickly before the ground above it collapsed. As his tunnel grew deeper and wider and more precarious, Stanley was able to feel latches on one end of the box and then a leather handle. It wasn't really a box. I think it might be some kind of metal suitcase, he told Zero. Can you pry it loose with the shovel? Zero suggested. I'm afraid the side of the hole will collapse. You might as well give it a try, said Zero. Stanley took a sip of water. Might as well, he said. He forced the tip of the shovel between the dud and the top of the metal case and tried to wedge it free. He wished he could see what he was doing. He worked the end of the shovel back and forth, up and down, until he felt the suitcase fall free. Then he felt the dud come piling down on top of it. But it wasn't a huge cave-in. As he knelt down in the hole, he could tell that only a small portion of the earth had collapsed. He dug with his hands until he found the leather handle, and then he pulled the suitcase up and out of the dirt. I got it, he exclaimed. It was heavy. He handed it up to Zero. You did it, Zero said, taking it from him. We did it, said Stanley. He gathered his remaining strength and tried to pull himself up out of the hole. Suddenly, a bright light was shining in his face. Thank you, said the warden. You boys have been a big help. The beam of the flashlight was directed away from Stanley's eyes and onto Zero, who was sitting on his knees. The suitcase was on his lap. Mr. Pendanski was holding the flashlight. Mr. Sir stood next to him with his gun drawn and pointed in the same direction. Mr. Sir was barefoot and bare-chested, wearing only his pajama bottoms. The warden moved toward Zero. She was also in her bedclothes, wearing an extra-long T-shirt. Unlike Mr. Sir, however, she had on her boots. Mr. Pendanski was the only one fully dressed. Perhaps he had been on guard duty. Off in the distance, Stanley could see two more flashlights bobbing toward them in the darkness. He felt helpless in the hole. You boys arrived just in the nick, the warden started to say. She stopped talking, and she stopped walking. Then she slowly backed away. A lizard had crawled up on the top of the suitcase. Its big red eyes glowed in the beam of the flashlight. Its mouth was open, and Stanley could see its white tongue moving in and out between the black teeth. Zero sat as still as a statue. A second lizard crawled up over the side of the suitcase and stopped less than an inch away from Zero's little finger. Stanley was afraid to look and afraid not to. He wondered if he should try to scramble out of the hole before the lizards turned on him, but he didn't want to cause any commotion. The second lizard crawled across Zero's fingers and halfway up his arm. It occurred to Stanley that the lizards were probably on the suitcase when he handed it to Zero. There's another one, gasped Mr. Pendanski. He shined the flashlight on the box of frosted flakes, which lay on its side beside Stanley's hole. A lizard was crawling out of it. The light also illuminated Stanley's hole. He glanced downward and had to force himself to suppress a scream. He was standing in a lizard nest. He felt the scream explode inside him. He could see 6 lizards. There were 3 on the ground, 2 on his left leg, and 1 on his right sneaker. He tried to remain very still. Something was crawling up the back of his neck. 3 other counselors approached the area. Stanley heard one say, "What's going?" and then whisper, "Oh my God." "What can we do?" asked Mr. Pendanski. "We wait," said the warden. "It won't be very long." "At least we'll have a body to give that woman," said Mr. Pendanski. "She's going to ask a lot of questions," said Mr. Sir, "and this time she'll have the AG with her." "Let her ask questions," said the warden. "Just so long as I have the suitcase, I don't care what happens. Do you know how long—" Her voice trailed off, then started up again. "When I was little, I'd watch my parents dig holes every weekend and holiday. When I got bigger, I had to dig too, even on Christmas." Stanley felt tiny claws dig into the side of his face as the lizard pulled itself off his neck and up past his chin. "It won't be long now," the warden said. Stanley could hear his heart beat. Each beat told him he was still alive, at least for 1 more second. 500 seconds later, his heart was still beating. Mr. Pendanski screamed. The lizard, which had been in the cereal box, was springing toward him. Mr. Sir shot it in midair. Stanley felt his blast shatter the air around him. The lizard scurried frantically across his very still body. He did not flinch. A lizard ran across his closed mouth. He glanced at Zero, and Zero's eyes met his. Somehow they were both still alive, at least for 1 more second, 1 more heartbeat. Mr. Sir lit a cigarette. "I thought you quit," said one of the other counselors. "Yeah, well, sometimes sunflower seeds just won't cut it." He took a long drag on his cigarette. "I'm going to have nightmares the rest of my life." "Maybe we should just shoot them," suggested Mr. Pendanski. "Who?" asked the counselor. The Lizards of the Kids. And that, dear readers, / listeners, / viewers, is the end of the story for the night. We will pick up holes again with part 10 on Thursday. Yes, quite a cliffhanger there. Quite a place to leave off, isn't it? And some quick hellos to other people who have watched. Hello, Mum. Thank you for sharing. Hello, Matt. Hello, Regina. Glad you two were able to join as well in the fun. And some shout outs to those who've been here from the start. Hello, Shay. Hello, Fleur. Hello, Mum. Hello, Miss Kuntz. Hello, Heather. And hello, Amber. Good question. What's the good question? Oh, yes. Hello. And hello, everyone else who's watching. Oh, yes. Which to shoot. Yeah. Everyone else who's watching who has not commented, hello to you as well. Glad you were able to join tonight, even though I was late. Sorry for that. But we still were able to have a good time, were we not? And we will pick up this good time tomorrow night with Dracula, and then Thursday night with more holes. So until then, last but not least. Oh, yes. Thank you. Have a great. You are most certainly welcome. You are most certainly welcome. So once again, join the Facebook group Storytime. Follow, like this video on YouTube, and follow me at BeeperCorny1. Or if you're watching it right now, you can just click subscribe below. And if you want in future, you can follow me on Twitch. Brett Doesn't Game, all one word. Until next time, dear all of you, however you wish to be addressed, I bid you adieu. Have a good night, and I will see you tomorrow at probably 10.